Fad diets. How do they work and why they fail? Hello my friends, I'm Dr. Sam, this is Dr. Sam's Health, and today I would like to talk about fad diets. The diets that pop up, gain some popularity, and then they fade away for one reason or another. Before we begin, my regular disclaimers. First of all, I'm a medical doctor, but I do not give any kind of medical advice or medical opinion here on YouTube or on my website, drsamshealth.com. Check it out, by the way. Also, I will express some opinions. I'm trying to prepare well for my videos and express them in the most neutral way. But at the same time, I would like to say that all these opinions are purely mine. They are not necessarily representative of the opinions or statements, positions of my colleges, universities, my profession. I'm a psychiatrist. And of course, since I'm going to talk about fad diets, I would like to be very generic, very general in my description of these diets, just because I don't want to offend anybody. Some people might be very fond of some specific fad diets and feel that they work for them, but today, for the purposes of this video, I would just like to discuss them as a general idea. So, without further ado, let's dive in. The very first question I think everybody should ask is, what is a fad diet? And that's a very loose, very vague concept. The idea is that at a certain point, there are some dietary approaches that have been promoted by some gurus, some celebrity trainers, some celebrities sometimes, some doctors, not necessarily medical doctors, but somebody who has some expertise in science, usually. And these diets gain some popularity. A lot of people are trying them on, even with some results, and we'll talk about it in a second. And then these diets kind of fail and fade away. And that's why we call them fad diets. How do these diets gain popularity? How do they get our attention? As I said, usually they have been promoted by somebody who has some credible credentials, expertise, a doctor in front of their name, celebrity, and these people tend to pick some isolated research finding or some sort of historical anecdote, some remote community that follows very specific dietary regimen, and these people tend to live longer lives. They don't know, quote unquote, about cancer, they don't know about metabolic syndrome and so on, and they are trying to replicate either the patterns of nutrition of this community or maybe some research findings from some isolated studies. And being humans, we always want to get some sort of the most efficient approach for weight loss. If we have been struggling with losing weight for months or years, we find this solution, this shortcut, and we buy in. I'm guilty myself. I've done it quite a few times. Sometimes you listen to somebody on YouTube or in the news, and they get your interest, and you pick up the idea. It sounds credible. There is some sort of a common sense approach or logic behind these dietary approaches, and I give them a try. And the irony is that these diets almost always, or in majority of cases, they provide you with very effective, very impressive results in the first several days, maybe a couple of weeks. So how does that happen? Why do these fad diets work, at least initially? And the answer is very simple. No matter what we do, if we take a look at these diets, they almost invariably lead to caloric restriction. Sometimes they don't even talk about caloric restriction or specifically say that, you don't have to count calories, you don't have to exercise, just do this thing or a couple of things and you will lose weight. And it does happen. But what happens is that no matter what approach they suggest, we tend to restrict our calories when we adhere to this approach. It can be restriction in timing of food intake, it can be restriction in terms of specific food categories that we are supposed to stick to or exclude from our diets, and the end result is we simply restrict our caloric intake. And when that happens, our natural physiological response to caloric restriction is the following. First of all, we use up all the readily available nutrients. Usually we're talking about glucose in our bloodstream, some nutrients that are still in our gut. Then we use up glycogen. That's the storage form of glucose that is mostly stored in our muscles and in our liver. People tend to have around a pound, maybe 300-400 grams of glycogen normally, and this glycogen is associated with water. So when we use up this glycogen, we also lose the water. And the ratio between glycogen and water is usually 1 to 4. So for 1 pound of glycogen, we actually tend to lose 4 pounds of water. It is already a substantial amount of water. Plus, the next thing that happens, we actually tend to introduce some sort of a cleanse in terms of the gut content. We lose some water and gut content. That's also several pounds of body weight. And then our bodies start digesting the nutrients that we don't have readily available for us. And we're talking about body fat, but also lean body mass. And most of the people who go on some sort of a fad diet, they tend to lose a decent amount of lean body mass. So the end result is in the first several days, maybe a couple of weeks of being on a specific fad diet, people tend to lose 5, 7, 10 pounds of body weight, and they feel that they are doing amazingly well in terms of their weight loss. And then this process stops because these people have not been losing primarily fat. They have been using lean body mass and body water. And that is very demotivating. I know that I promised you not to talk about any specific fad diets for a variety of reasons, but I still would like to illustrate the concepts I've been talking about, and I'll give you an example. This example is pretty much real life example. It is a friend of mine who does something ridiculous with his diet, if we can call it this way. Every time he goes on vacation, he switches to just drinking beer. He loves beer, he goes on all-inclusive resorts, and all he does is just drinks beer. He doesn't eat anything. It is a ridiculous dietary approach. Please don't do it. It doesn't make any sense. Actually, we'll talk about this. There is a little bit of sense behind that. But what happens is, despite clearly affecting his liver and his overall health with this diet, he tends to lose weight. And he claims that it's the best approach ever. He does it, he calls it a cleanse, which again is very counterproductive idea. But there is a physiological basis that actually explains everything that happens in his body. So essentially what happens is that normally he consumes somewhere between 2,500 to 3,500 kilocalories per day, which is a substantial amount of energy that he gets, and he gains weight throughout his life, several grams a day, whatever this amount is. And when he goes on vacation and he switches to drinking beer, he drinks like 4, 5, 6 cans of beer or pints. And essentially what happens is he reduces his caloric intake for this, say, 3,000 kilocalories a day to somewhere close to 1,000. So it's like 30% of his normal energy intake, and it's way less than his basal metabolic rate. And essentially, he doesn't get much nutrients with this beer. It's like empty calories. I don't like this term, but it is literally empty calories in this case. So he gets most of his calories come from alcohol. There is some glucose or carbohydrates in this beer, maybe some minimal amounts of fiber, almost no fat, if any, and minimal amounts of protein. His body starts using its internal resources. Glycogen, he loses water, he loses glycogen. Essentially, he cleanses his gut too. And since his body doesn't get enough protein, his body starts literally self-digestion process. It eats up his own muscle or lean body tissue. And essentially what happens is, despite this diet, if we can call it diet, he tends to be in a significant caloric deficit. He loses a lot of weight, usually like 10 pounds over the course of a vacation, and he's very proud. But the essential, or the gist of the outcome is that he loses lean body mass, he loses body water. As soon as he comes back home, he regains this weight. And that is a great illustration of how some ridiculous concept can be actually justified on some physiological level, and at the same time, it's absolutely detrimental and counterproductive approach for weight loss. So something similar happens to almost all fad diets. You tend to lose decent amount of body weight, which is primarily body water and some lean body mass, maybe small amounts of body fat. And then when your body hits certain level of fat loss, when all these resources are depleted, the body switches to fat loss. And fat loss is much, much slower. And even if you are in a significant caloric deficit, you will still lose fat relatively at a very, very slow pace. And that is the moment when people realize that the diet doesn't work anymore. And it is very demotivating, and people tend to question themselves, question the guru, question the approach. They tend to either stick to this diet very religiously for a certain period of time, usually to the detriment to their health, or they start deviating and then they regain weight essentially. So that's how these diets work, and that's why most of the people fail on these diets. So the point of this video is actually very simple. There are multiple dietary approaches that sound good, too good to be true. They're usually promoted by some people with some sort of a credibility and some sort of a clout, and they might even work in a very short-term perspective, and they might become very popular, but in many cases, these dietary approaches do not really work. You do not really lose body fat. You just waste several weeks of your life and some inspiration to try something that even in theory shouldn't really work, and it gets you nowhere, essentially. You get demotivated in the end of this approach, and you start thinking that everything that people offer to you, healthcare professionals, nutritionists, dietitians, is not really working. And actually, I likely will make one video about this idea that diets do not work. It is actually not true. Good diets really work and really work well. But I want you to be very cautious when you start some sort of a fad diet. Do a little bit of research, and you will might realize a couple of things. One is that you do not have the wealth of knowledge to actually conceptualize or understand the way this diet works. And usually that's the problem, because a lot of people on YouTube or in social media, in the news outlets, they are promoting certain concepts that do sound scientific, they do sound logical, reasonable, but they aren't. And also, my approach is usually I'm trying to find some sort of a good research study, a clinical trial of certain dietary approach. And with these fad diets, they pop up very quickly. They gain popularity quickly. And usually scientists do not have enough time to do a proper clinical trial. Usually it takes several years to conduct a good research, to prepare, to obtain funding for this, to find volunteers to try this approach. And there are lots of, not issues, but things that people have to do in order to conduct a proper clinical research. So usually there is a lack of scientific evidence for these diets, and people tend not to know enough to pretty much dissect this approach and understand whether it's going to work or not. And that is why I think that prior to embarking on some sort of a fad diet or a new popular diet, talk to your doctor, talk to a dietitian, talk to a professional. Actually, one of the reasons that I've written this book, The Rational Diet, which is not a fad diet, by the way, I don't promise any kind of super fast results there, is that I want you to know the basics. And the first chapter of the book is essentially talking about the metabolism, how it works, what are the components of our metabolic energy expenditures, energy intake, what kind of energy we get, and what kind of biochemical reactions happen in response to carbohydrates, fat, protein, what kind of vitamins and micronutrients we need in general, and so on. So the book is wealth of knowledge, and I highly recommend it. So don't buy into the hype of new popular diets, new popular trends. Do your own research, talk to professionals, study research literature if you can and you have access to. And of course, shameless plug, check out my book, The Rational Diet. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video useful, and I hope to see you in my next videos, which I'll definitely keep making. Thank you so much. All the very best.